Welcome to A Real Affliction, BPD Culture and Stigma, a podcast devoted to exploring how we experience, treat, write about, advocate for, and conceptualize borderline personality disorder. My name is Cynthia Gralla. I'm a writer and teacher with a history of BPD. Here is the text on the first few pages of Jessie Shepherd's fantastic children's book, Millie the cat has borderline personality disorder. This is Millie. She has borderline personality disorder. She is scared of being alone. She hates being alone. Sometimes she sees her friend Peter as completely perfect. Sometimes she sees Peter as all bad. Either way, she does not want him to leave. Sometimes Millie has intense anger, which makes her feel guilty, which makes her feel worthless. Today, I'll be speaking with Jessie about why she saw the need for this book. Jessie is a licensed clinical mental health counselor, licensed professional counselor, and director of Blue Clover Therapy. I wish I'd had a therapist like her when I began to suspect I had BPD many years ago. My terror at receiving a stigmatized diagnosis would have been counterpoised by her conviction that there are graces as well as agonies within a borderline mind. As Jessie writes of Millie, and by extension, all people with BPD, she even sees aspects in others that most people miss, like when people try to hide that they are hurt or scared. A readiness to empathize with others is our birthright, and I think this is important to remember during Borderline Personality Disorder Awareness Month. Jessie's zeal for spreading compassion for BPD is palpable throughout our conversation, as is her avidity for dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT. She initially wrote Millie the cat for the clients in her DBT group back in 2010. Since DBT will come up frequently during interviews over the course of this podcast, I'd like to say a few words about it here. The word dialectical in DBT refers to the fact that it teaches two seemingly opposite things: how to accept ourselves and how to change. Over what is often a 6-month group course, but maybe longer, people learn mindfulness, distress tolerance, interpersonal skills, and emotional regulation. While Marsha Linehan designed DBT for people with borderline personality disorder, it can also be used to treat eating disorders, substance use disorder, and depression. In other words, it has wide applications, and Jessie believes that everyone should do DBT. And why not? Which of us couldn't benefit from learning to tolerate distress in 2024? Please check out Jessie's own podcast, The Morning Struggle, which discusses DBT skills, among other topics. I've also included a link in the episode notes to the Millie the Cat book, whose Kindle edition Jessie has generously made available for free download in the US. Here's the first part of our interview. This is a book that I first became aware of this past Christmas because my husband gave it to me, and I opened it and he expected me to put it aside and we take turns opening each other's gifts so we could move on. But I was like, no, I have to read this right now. And I read it and I just started crying because it's so special. And I want to talk about the challenges in writing it. But Jessie, you've managed to, I think, capture the experience of BPD really succinctly and clearly and compassionately. So I think this book is such a gift. And I'd love to start with asking you about what made you write it.
Well, so initially, when I started being a therapist, I was in charge of the dialectic behavioral therapy group at my office. Fantastic therapy, love it. It has a lot of good skills, really just a fantastic therapy modality. But what I found was the majority of the clients that were coming into this group were newly diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And oof, you come in with that diagnosis and it's not very positive. Because
Right.
the first thing you do is you Google it. Oh my goodness.
It's such a bad idea, but we all Google it. Yes.
Of course, of course. But it was heartbreaking. The things that they were coming in and talking about just absolutely broke my heart. So Millie the cat actually started off as me on a whiteboard writing out the things that we have to cope with, and then the most beautiful parts of borderline personality disorder. It was remarkable. People would sit there and be stumped about the amazing things that come out of borderline personality disorder, just the strengths that we have. And so that was kind of the first turning point where I'm like, we need better information out here. It can't just be all negative, but we have to understand what it is as well, right? We have to know what we have to cope with. So that's what I was looking for. I spent a lot of time trying to gather information. There is some beautiful research out there about borderline personality disorder and the strengths and things. But then I wanted to make it more simplistic so that you can use it as either like a starting point or to explain it to other folks, like other people in your family, where it's palatable. And so there's kind of a good understanding before you launch into your research on the internet.
I was just talking about this issue with Paula Tusiani from Emotions Matter, a great nonprofit for BPD in the US, and she's going to be on the show as well. But we were discussing how this first Google search for information on BPD is so notorious that they even talked about it on the TV show Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, where when the main character, which is quite a sympathetic and in-depth portrayal of BPD, and when the main character first is diagnosed, her therapist tells her, don't Google it. And Paula was agreeing no one should do it. But of course she does. And she feels terrible. And this is something that will come up in multiple interviews, just that there is a long history of using this diagnosis pejoratively. You have probably read Sarah Maslund, who does a lot of research and advocacy on BPD. And she says that it's really since the 1930s that people have been using this diagnosis for patients that they just found difficult, hard to treat. And even though it wasn't, I don't think the diagnosis was in the DSM until 1980. But it goes far back. It's become this marker for any problematic behavior. I've seen on BPD subreddits husbands coming in and saying, oh, my wife did this thing I don't like. Do you think she has BPD? And it doesn't have anything to do with any of the criteria. Once it was my wife, at first we had an active sex life, but now she's taking care of the kids and she's working and she doesn't want to have sex as often. Does she have BPD? We're like, no, she's just exhausted from her child rearing, but that is the kind of thing people contend with. And so that was why I cried, because to have something so loving that so clearly captures some of the key challenges is such a gift. So it was in 2017 you wrote it, or somewhere around there?
So I think it was published 2015. I had a notebook version of it in 2010 that I was just kind of Xeroxing. So it started off in just a random notebook I had, and I started giving it out, and it made sense to move into an actual printed copy where my handwriting was a little better and, and we could really get down to the meat of some different coping skills and ways to make sure that it got to the audience it needed to.
At that time, were there other children's books that dealt with any kind of mental health problem that you were drawing inspiration? Anything like that?
I didn't find any specifically. I know there's a plethora now, which I think is absolutely lovely. As a therapist, I have just a whole bookshelf full of them. I couldn't find anything specific that I necessarily took from, especially not borderline personality disorder, find anything there. And that was initially what I was trying to find. That's why Millie came to be. The big piece that we were kind of going for was having the images in the back be real life images, and Millie and the other characters being cartoon animals. I wanted them to be where we could all look at them and be like, yeah, I could be a cartoon cat, kind of like this silly thing, but then also kind of how sometimes we feel out of sync with our environment. So kind of being able to be like this loving character that we're going through this journey with, is living in the day to day and sometimes feels a little out of sorts and sometimes feels more grounded, but making sure that they're a likable character, that it's part of the journey. It's part of everybody's
Yes.
journey. We all have mental pieces that we're managing, whether we're clinically diagnosed or not. Every single one of us is dealing with some sort of mental symptom and have to
Yeah.
manage that and cope. And so why not make it where it's more palatable for one, but also
Right.
more relatable in that we all have it. So let's
Yeah.
figure out how to do the best things we can with what we have and join together instead of, butt heads or put negative things out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that kind of segues into something else I wanted to ask about. I love the photoreal backgrounds with the drawn animals, and you do all of the drawings as well as the text. That is that correct?
Actually, no. My husband Ty
Oh, nice.
does the drawings. Yeah, we tend to go find images. They're like, ooh, this is nice together.
Yes.
But and then I do all of the wording.
I was curious about, it's kind of a two-part question, and you've already sort of gestured towards why it's a children's book, because I think this is a children's book, but it has a pretty broad audience. So, why a children's book, and who did you imagine as the audience when you were working on it? I mean, certainly there can be more than one.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the pieces I wasn't really sure where it was going to fall. I just knew
Mhm.
what I was giving out. The clinical group that I initially designed this for was kind of those mid 20, early 30s kind of age
Hmm.
group. And what I found was with the stress levels that were happening, a lot of that rational, logical thinking wasn't happening. When we're so distressed and we have so much emotion going, our cortisol levels are through the roof. We're not necessarily bringing in the information and understanding. It tends to be
Hmm.
more on emotion. So I wanted to make sure that all the points were very precise in that way for if you are newly diagnosed, that you can read through and really understand, because it is a stressful situation as something's
Yeah.
brought to the table and trying to figure out how that's going to work with your world. That was the initial population. But what I've found over the years, as I'm talking to families, and because not only do I see folks who were diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, but also their families and
Right.
kind of understanding how they can support their loved one and all of that.
Yeah.
And that includes their children. And,
Yes.
so what they have going on too. And so Millie's been actually a really good resource for the family as well, because as you're bringing everybody in and trying to discuss coping skills and symptoms and the different therapeutic routes you can go on, it's a clean way to just kind of, these are the things that you're going to have symptom wise, these are the strengths, let's talk about these
Mhm.
strengths, how can we build on them together. And so it's a mixed population that I've found really like the book, which is neat. I think it's so
Right.
cool that it's a resource for everybody. But yeah, so it does tend to fall under the children's book bracket, but the original was definitely an adult.
Right. And I mean, I think that's quite common. The genre of children's books is pretty capacious and can be anything from very, very simple books being used to teach children to read to things like I always get the title wrong, but like The Boy, the Fox, the Horse, and that
Oh,
one,
oh, I love
that
that one.
beautiful
Yes.
one.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, things like that definitely adults appreciate as well. And so yeah, it's children's book, but like I would have loved to see it when I was in my late 20s, early 30s, which was my most kind of acute period with the disorder. Having something simple that, yes, you don't have to wade through anything scientific, anything that feels even slightly recriminating, or that's really nice. Yeah, I love the focus on the family in the book. I could definitely imagine it being used for a younger sibling who, has just been diagnosed with BPD and they need to understand it. And I noticed at the end, you give this great suggestion that everyone in the family can benefit from DBT, which is just a phenomenal suggestion. Is that a kind of common suggestion that therapists give in your experience when people get diagnosed with BPD, that everyone should go through DBT?
Well, I think so. I know the clinicians at our office and folks that I'm other clinicians that I'm close to do suggest DBT for really everybody. DBT
Yeah,
is a vast amount of skills that you can
yeah,
use, and then yeah, you can use it within that client, right? But then also within the
right.
family structure, and you can support
Yeah,
each other using those skills. So I really love DBT. I use
yeah.
DBT. It's a good one. But as far as like the family structure, it definitely goes smoother if everyone is on board with the different skills and the strategies and things that are going to be happening in the household.
Mhm.
And so each person can suggest certain things and how it would work in the household, because not every household's the same. And yeah, I absolutely love DBT. And I think that everyone can benefit from it, especially if you're supporting, which we should be supporting our family members and household, in their
Absolutely.
getting healthy and feeling good.
Well, I wanted to get your endorsement of that out into the world
Absolutely.
because I think it's really heartening to hear that suggestion for people. I also was incredibly heartened the other day when I talked to Bailey McKnight of the BPD Society of British Columbia. It was from her. I found out that in some high schools in the United States, they're also doing sort of preventative DBT programs, not just in terms of BPD, but to help students with stress management and kind of suicide prevention. Do you have any involvement with that?
No, I not within the school systems, but I know that there's a few different programs
Yeah.
that take certain skills from DBT. And I think it's I love it when I get that parents should know flyer that comes home and I'm like, yay, this is
Yeah.
happening. But I
Yeah.
absolutely think it should be part of the curriculum. It should be part of all the skills that we learn. I full-heartedly believe everyone should be in therapy or at least have a therapist. You can meet your needs as they come up. And
Yeah.
I mean, every therapist needs a therapist. So I
Right.
think everyone in the world should have a therapist too.
Right. It should trickle down in that sense, What was the hardest thing about writing this book, if there was anything hard?
I think probably the most difficult part is really being able to write about kind of that hopeless, worthless piece without necessarily going into the severity or the consequences that can
Yeah.
occur as those symptoms get worse. Specifically, because I wanted to make it so families could read it and
Right.
understand it in the hopes that they have mental health and medical providers that are walking them through the process. I know that some folks do criticize Millie the cat for having that element in there, but I also feel like it's really important that we talk about the feeling of worthlessness and hopelessness because that's part of being a human being, and we don't
Absolutely.
want to ignore. We don't want to ignore that exists because then it just gets worse.
Right.
So,
And it can make you feel ashamed if you feel like
oh,
it's this thing that isn't talked about. So I'm surprised that people have criticized that aspect, but is it because they think it's too dark?
yeah, I think maybe it brings up maybe conversations that they're not comfortable having with other family members or their
Yeah.
partners, things like that. Or even just recognizing that in ourselves. Sometimes we want to ignore the fact that we feel hopeless or kind of
Mm,
put our blinders on. And I
right.
mean, we can get through a certain amount of life that way, but when it comes down to it, if you truly are doing the DBT skills, that has to come up. You have to
Yeah.
express. So yeah, I think for some folks it's uncomfortable to talk about worthlessness and hopelessness. I mean, I'm a therapist, so I talk about it all the time with
Right.
folks, and
Yeah.
that I'm very comfortable with it.
Yeah.
But I do know that can bring up some conversations that are a little uncomfortable.
Mhm.
But I also felt like it was really important, so that wasn't something we were going to budge on as far as that goes. And I do feel like
Yeah.
it's a piece of it for sure.
Oh, I agree. I think it's so important. I think different cultures too have this outlook on, oh, you have to feel hopeful or there's something almost morally wrong with it. You're supposed to have this faith that things will get better. And if you don't, there's stigma just against that one element. But I think this is such a common feeling in BPD.
Absolutely. Well, and with children as they are going through their world, we
Mhm.
want them to know that that's normal as well. And I think that's probably
Right.
part of those programs that you're talking about. They're
Yeah.
teaching DBT skills is just
Hmm.
recognizing that, I mean, that's a very normal emotion. And if we're open about it and we communicate and we cope and all those good things, really some really neat elements come out of that, some connecting and really getting that healthy mindset. You have to be really
Right.
honest about the feelings that you're having.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I love the focus on the more positive aspects, which I agree about. There are some sweet dividends to a disorder that causes you to feel so much, to be so sensitive, to be really passionate, and at heart, to really want to connect with other people. I mean, you do such a good job of describing that. The vicious cycle where you want to be with people. You certainly, the last thing you want is them to leave, but sometimes you inadvertently drive them away. But at heart, wanting to connect with people is a kind of a beautiful thing, especially as we all get a little more isolated, and especially after something like COVID. I want to thank Jessie Shepherd for participating in this interview. Please come back for the second half on June 1st, and I put a link to her wonderful book in the episode notes.